Hello, welcome to Buffer is a Lie, how to plan a game production budget. My name is Łukasz Hacura. I've been around for a bit, mostly worked on premium PC and console games. And for the last 12 years, I'm running Anshar Studios. And surprise, surprise, we're mostly doing premium PC and console games. So, first I want to start, before I'm going to talk about how to solve a problem of budgeting a video game, let's define the problem, and maybe let's define the reasons why nobody can do it, and I don't believe you can. So, first biggest problem from my perspective is the fact that nobody knows how to make games. Like, let's just establish that. And the reason for that is that I strongly believe that if you're not creating a sequel or a clone with minimal changes, using the same team, you don't know what you're doing, okay? You're gonna find out things about the game that you're creating that you didn't know first, and all your assumptions are basically shit. But hey, don't take it from me. I have only 18 years of experience, so you can take it from Patrice Desilets that said it at this year's reboot, with 27 years of experience, right? To be fair, he mentioned that, he knows how to kind of budget his games, right? How to plan his games, but like with a very specific genre. And then if you don't take him from him, let's go up, 33 years of experience, right? It's like, I know the actual scope and a budget of a video game when I'm more or less halfway done, right? And that was Maciej Miąsik, who's here with us today, at Gamedec Evening Conference. And if you don't believe him, Brian Fargo at this very conference at Digital Dragons, 41 year of experience, said that you cannot control video game development, right? It's chaos and you just need to roll with it and mitigate the changes and the risk associated with it. Another specific example, this year there was a very good talk at GDC, shipping Diablo 4. Now Diablo 4, the team of Diablo 4 estimated the launch date more or less 2 years before launch, and they were sure of it, and they hit that date a year from launch. Now, why it's important? The total development time of Diablo, depending how you count, Diablo 3 launched 12 years earlier, right? But depending how you count, it took them at least 6 years to develop Diablo 4. And they were absolutely ecstatic at this speech that they were able to predict precisely the launch date when they were 2/3 in a project, right? And it's not a diss at Blizzard in no way. It's just to showcase how difficult it is to actually budget and estimate timelines in a production of a video game. But hey, at Anshar Studios, I often hear that the problem with our budgets and with our budgeting is the fact that every time we do a different game, right? We do a different technology. We do like a match-free game on XNA. We use Unity for a hidden object game. We then shifted to VR. Then we started doing remasters in a horror genre. We did our own RPG, a remake. And now we're doing a co-op shooter out of all things, right, in first person. So every project different. Obviously, we don't know how to make video games, right, because every video game we're doing are different. But let's take Larian Studios, right? Like, they know what they're doing, right? It's like RPG, 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 right? So they surely know how to budget a video game. Well, clearly they don't, because nobody does, right? Divinity Original Sin 2 blew up, the budget blew up, and they were surprised by the amount of work. But they took all that lessons to heart, and Sven was talking about it at this morning's keynote. They took all that lessons to heart, and lo and behold, they were still surprised by the amount of work on Baldur's Gate 3, right? And their budget, again, went to shit. So I think that my case is, if Larian Studios doesn't know how to make video games, nobody does. That's my takeaway. Okay, so that's problem number one. Now, but let's dive a little deeper into the reasons of over-budgeting and going over budget. Parkinson's law. I mean, that law was developed mostly for government administration, but it works perfectly in game development. So the Parkinson's law is that the demand upon a resource tends to expand too much supply. What does that mean? It means that if theoretically a thing can be done by 5 programmers, but you give them 10, Suddenly, in a couple of months, 10 programmers become absolutely necessary to finish that thing, right? Like the demand upon a resource tends to expand. But on the other hand, we have the overconfidence bias. Like initially, especially if we want to pitch it to publisher, right? Initially, when we budget a video game, we're like super confident, super optimistic. It looks more or less like this. The overconfidence bias, obviously, is overestimation of your knowledge and abilities, which makes you deviate from reality. And it looks like this, right? If I would estimate how long it take me to walk from our studio at Anshar to this here Congress Center, it should take me 18 hours, 27 minutes. Who wants to bet that that's not gonna happen, right? It's like, it's not gonna take 18 hours, but this is how we budget video games all the time. Another problem, and I think that the most prevalent in video game development is scope change, right? We're ending up doing a different video game than we set out to do. And it's one of the most common factors, and most projects I worked on had drastic scope changes. I've talked, one of the good examples for this, are there any Bloober team guys here? No? Nobody? There are a couple, okay. So on Unreal Fest at 2023, I talked about lessons learned from the remake of Layers of Fear. So that's a slide from that presentation. That was the initial scope of the project, okay? Just remake Layers of Fear 1 in new technology, okay? This is what we ended up doing, okay? Like Layers of Fear 1, Layers of Fear 2, the anthology, 2 additional hours of gameplay, added simplified combat. So yeah, that was a totally different project at the end. And sunken cost fallacy is another problem. So we are often reluctant to abandon projects that, frankly, should be abandoned. And the thing is, and it's with the overconfidence bias is a great correlation here also, is like we perfectly see other developers that should cancel their projects. It's just our projects that never should be canceled because they're like valid projects, right? And again, I'm not dissing the developers here, right? But we all know that there were a lot of projects and a lot of productions that, you know, like frankly, somebody should have pulled the plug much earlier, right? We know the horror stories of the development, the pivots. We actually have a couple examples also in Polish development, but you know, let's not talk about them. So I hope nobody's from BioWare or Ubisoft is here. So, but I talked to many people at Ubisoft just not working on this project, and they were absolutely sure that this project should have been canceled. Okay, buffer is a lie, the title of this talk. How I like to explain this problem is using the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Basically, like the game dev uncertainty principle is that you cannot precisely measure both the budget and the scope at the same time because one affects the others and changes the context of the video game production. So, if you introduce the buffer, you change the context, and everybody knows about it, right? And you cannot have a secret buffer, because what is a secret buffer? Is that free programmers stashed in some, shelf, but during the night they're being, updated on the progress of the project, so that you can easily plug them in as a buffer? No. You're going to put them on a project, right, at some point, and Parkinson's law, they're going to change the context, and your buffer is gone, and you're not going to use it for emergency. You're going to use it to make a more complex, better quality video game, right? So buffer is a lie. But it's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying don't buffer your things, because money is freedom, right? When you have more money to play with, in general, if you're aware of that, it's still good. It's like you can still have some movement of it. It's just usually you're not using that money for the things that you wanted to use. And the last problem is projects are not created in a vacuum, right? They're created in some kind of a context. So you can have talent availability problem. Time and again, we had this problem on Anshar Studios that you budgeted a video game having a certain talent in mind, then the negotiations with the publisher took too long, right? And suddenly that team is not available anymore. They're doing something else, right? And you're scrambling, you're hiring, you have additional costs, and the external context with no fault of the budgeting on its own took a hit. Company might have changed strategies, right? It's kind of associated with a scope change, but it can come from your own company. Like suddenly the company says everything needs to be gas, but this game was never planned for lives. Well, tough shit, right? Figure out how to add lives up to it. Industry situation, welcome 2024, right? Everybody's loving, have a good time, yeah. So, nobody could predict nobody. That's a different talk. But it's of no fault of yours at 2024 that you were supposed to, while budgeting a project, right, taking such an event into account. And there are events that are happening out there, and I'm not even talking about COVID, not even talking about war, but who could predict that in Poland in 2021, 2022, in video game development, at least at Anshar Studios, because in the world, in Poland has inflation of what, like 16%, something like that, right? But in video game development, it was like 40, because it was post-COVID bubble, remote work opened up, and suddenly the talent was going to work. Time zones saved us, kind of, but going to work for the United States. And suddenly at Anshar Studios in 2022 with like 40% inflation. What buffer can take on 40% of increase on salaries, right? Like you cannot predict this shit. So let's try to solve it. So first thing, like if you're gonna take from this talk only just one thing, like take this one, is phase-based production. So basically divide and conquer, okay? You don't plan for the entire game. Don't even try it. It's very hard. What you do is basically you break down to phases. Some of those phases have been thrown around very often, right? Like, oh, we're in deep shit because we didn't do proper pre-production. That's you hear it all the time, probably. But the thing is that the way you think about it is not only on the milestones, is like, hey, do we have like a proof of concept, vertical slice, alpha, beta, everybody knows about it, right? But actually how you have different attitude to budget and to success on different stages. So first stage is ideation. It's not pre-production, okay? Because ideation is all about making things shitty and making things fast and proving to yourself that your game idea is actually valid, right? That it makes sense to create this video game, to commit a lot of resources to this video game. So you want to do it cheaply, you want to do it fast, and if it doesn't pan out, you should cancel the project, right? Not like try to revive it 6 times. It's like kill the project. Then you enter into pre-production, and pre-production is a vastly different mindset than ideation, right? Because suddenly you need to prepare for production. You need to create your pipelines. You need to create your tools. You need to be able, this is now what we are doing. This is how we are doing phase of a video game development, right? And so you're still not scaling up the team. You're not rushing. We love rushing into production because we think that makes the game finish faster, right? Because we have those milestones already put in with the publishers, etc., etc. But it's actually doing us a disservice. And then when you're nice and ready, in an ideal world, I never seen it in real life, but no. In the ideal world, production is the easiest part, right? Because you already have the tools. You already have the design. You know what kind of game. You already proved that this game makes sense. So now you're just throwing in money, hoping that you're going to get the content and content back, right? And most of the systems are already done, so the variability also is low. And then you add post-production. And from my experience, ideation and post-production are the most difficult phases, at least in Polish video game development. I don't know why it's maybe inherently to Poland. But we tend to do post-production and post-launch. Right? So that's the issue. And post-production is where the magic happens. This is where Metacritics is made. This is when you actually have a game, you have your beta, you have your systems, you have your content, and now you're polishing stuff. And now you're actually making the game better and let it cook, right? And you should actually spend budget on that. And we usually treat it, in video game development, we treat it as a buffer, right, for production, post-production. And then we do post-production and post-launch. And then we do enhanced edition, but that's different discussion. Okay, now, Some of you may have been working in a developer that funds their own projects, right, through their own proceeds, but a lot of us also work with publishers, right? And there is this need to sign the entire game. It's like, hey, because it's like, give us a false sense of safety. It's like, hey, I've signed a $10 million game, right? But no, you signed that you're going to receive a $10 million. You don't know if it's going to be a $10 million game yet, right? And it's much better, you're in much better position to renegotiate when you only sign, for example, for a vertical slice or for a POC, right? Because then you actually know what type of game you are doing. And it doesn't give you any safety to sign an entire game because you're 100%, you're going to have termination clauses on the side of the publisher. So they can cancel anytime they want. It's just you need to deliver on the original budget, right? So don't be afraid to not sign the entire game. On that side, I recommend the book Playful Production Process, one of the best books on production that is out there, and still valid in 2024. 22 years ago, Mark Cerny did a DICE Summit talk method. I had the pleasure to talking to Mark at workshop at DICE this year, and I said to him, "Yeah, this is like the best talk." And he was like, "Yeah, but the sad part is that after 20-something years, it's still so relevant, right? Like the industry hasn't learned." So go and watch that talk. It's really good. Okay. Another part is controlling. Now, controlling is basically deeply understanding what is your cost structure, what is your man-month cost with overheads, because this is the most important part of your budget, and reviewing it and doing projections regularly, right? At Anshar, we do it at every minor milestone. Major milestone is, like vertical slice, alpha, beta. Minor milestones are usually like every 2 months to show progress to the publisher. At a thing that we called an executive sync, not to stress out the people, only called executive review. They were kind of stressed, so we called it executive sync. This is the dashboard with obviously fake data that I have access to, that I can actually see the projections, the actual burn rate right now. I can see which project is in the green, which project is in the red, what are our margins, what are our buffers, like everything, right? And the actual man-month costs. But I won't delve, it's about budgeting, not controlling. If you want to learn more about controlling, our CFO made a talk about it last year in GAC, go check it out. Let's focus on budgeting. So from the budgeting perspective, you start with some type of context. There's always a context. Like imagine that you need to do an action adventure game. What does that mean, right? Those are all action adventure games. I hope that we agree that those are different budgets, right? So you always start with some type of context. You, for example, know that this publisher is looking on a $30 to $60 million this and this genre ticket, right? You know the context. So you start with that context and you start filling out your ideal team. Like, I think that in that context, in that genre, this is my team composition, right? And then you actually check it with somebody who actually does video games for a living, not me, right? You check with somebody, and that reshapes your context because it's like suddenly, oh no, you're about this wrong. If this is the USP, then we need to focus more on that, and suddenly changes your context, and your budget is twice the budget that you thought initially it's going to be, right? So you now need to reshape the context. Okay, so maybe we'll actually remove that USP, or maybe we add something else, or maybe we'll cut the game in half, or whatever else. And rinse and repeat, and you do it a couple of times. That's basically how you do a budget. There's no super, like there are some tricks to it which I will go deeply, but it's not magic. So this is an example spreadsheet of a budget. It's super simple, no magic in it, like this is a zoom of it, right? So we just put it, our guesstimate of, hey, we think that in this phase it would be nice to be having a combat designer, for example, right? And that phase would be nice to have this. And your budget is basically the man months, right? I know video games is not only man months, it kinda is. Your overall budget is man months, right? And usually stuff like localization, music, voiceovers, this stuff usually gets handled by a publisher either way, right? So, and most of your budget is man months with overheads. Okay. One neat trick that we do in that iteration of redefining the context of the budget is in detail breakdown. This is something that we borrowed the technique from, or have been taught by Saber Interactive, is that you do a mental exercise of actually breaking down a feature or a content that you assume is going to kind of work this way. This is obviously an assumption. This is obviously an exercise, but it's very helpful. So for example, hey, we estimate that in this video game would need mechanical enemies. Let's say that 8 of them. What it actually means to create a mechanical enemy, right? So you try to break it down, and suddenly you see, okay, we need 18 man months and this specialization. We need concept artists, animators, character art, etc. And then you check this in detail breakdown with your initial gut feeling of how big is your team, and you just check yourself that is your thinking actually correct? And then again, rinse, repeat, that reshapes your context, and you do it all over again. For example, we actually did a budget for a big remake of a AAA game, but it was like I knew the context of it, and the context of it, it couldn't cost above a certain amount of money. So I knew like, hey, we need to do it with 100 people, more or less, right? And if we need to do it with 100 people in peak, this means that probably around 40 and 50 of them will be artists, right? And if around 40 and 50 of them will be artists, I guesstimate that around 5 of them will need to be VFX, right? And I go back to the team, and the team like explains to me how we need at least 15 VFX on this. Like, what? It's like, that's the third of an art team. Why? Like, explain it to me. Why do we need 15 VFX? So they started explaining to me like how the original game was made, what it means for the current, and we had a discussion that ended up with the fact, okay, we need to buy Houdini licenses, we need to change our pipelines, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do that, and then maybe we can do it with 10, right? You need to have these discussions, and we need to have this process. And it's very tiresome. It takes actually weeks to prepare it this way, because you need to check with various departments, various specializations. So we do it at a very late stage of pitching, right? Such a in-depth budgeting. Scope change. I had to put something here, right? I couldn't put, like, I have no idea how to handle it. So I went with strong leadership team. You need to have an executive producer that can say to a publisher no, right? Or at least say to the CEO, hey, please tell them no. Because it's very hard sometimes to determine what is an iteration and what is a scope change, right? And actually, that also means that you need to have a very strong creative direction of the project, because it's super easy to misread iteration and polish from feature creep and pivoting, right? And actually, you know, adding stuff and changing stuff. Like, what is an iteration of a feature, and what is trying 5 different features to solve a particular problem, right? And the later it is in the development process, especially in post-production, it's super important. It's super easy to start changing drastically the foundations of your video game, saying that, hey, we're polishing. And that's actually a major scope change. And hopefully you're working with entities, either your board or your publisher, that understands how video game development works, right? And they understand that changes happen when the creative vision changes after ideation or inside the production, where we know more. If you don't work with such entities, I don't like working with civilians, by the way, right? I don't like to work with entities that are not from game dev, don't understand game dev. But if you do, please have a good lawyer, right? And like, make sure you have proper agreements signed in about what is a change and what is not. I have a lot of stories for different time, maybe a beer today, but few of them end well, right? Like, most of the projects I worked on had drastic scope changes. But remember, scope change can go both ways. And one of the greatest tools that a producer can have is an axe. And you can always chop something out of the project, especially on the content side. And I strongly suggest using it often. Okay, for the love of God, console projects. It's like, there is a limited amount of games that we can create in our lives, right? Let's focus on the ones that are worthy of actually finishing them, of actually creating them. In the ideation phase, it's an expected result. It's like, it should be a more probable result, actually. It's like, hey, we gave it a shot. It's not an amazing idea. Don't fool yourself into the fact that, no, we're going to solve it in production, right? I've seen it time and I've done it time and again. If you have doubts, use external playtesting for validation. Is your idea actually good? And we're also sinners here, right? We also don't cancel projects often. Actually, if we think about it, we canceled one project, like canceled. And how we canceled it? We're stuck in the ideation phase. We're trying to find it, one prototype, second prototype, third prototype, fourth prototype, and we're stuck in this loop. And I thought, being inside that as executive producer, I thought, yeah, we're looking like it's like that's the iterative process. That makes sense. And then I went for vacation. And I got some rest, and after a week it was so clear it needs to be canceled. This doesn't make any sense. So I come back, I canceled the project, and you know what my head of department said? Congratulations on a wise decision. I'm like, why didn't you tell me earlier? It's like, again, people know where projects should be canceled, but somehow projects don't get canceled, and they should. Okay. As I said before, you need to buffer anyway, right? The buffer changed context, but money is good, right? Having more money, having more opportunities to make mistakes with that money is always better. Ideally, you would have around 30% of buffer apart from your overheads, apart from your margin, right? So it suddenly becomes like a scary number because it's like, hey, I have 30% overheads, 30% margin, and 30% buffer. That's basically over 100%. 110, if I count correctly, 110% of, yeah, because you multiply, you don't add it. Over 100% of a buffer, right? And don't multiply the buffers. If the lead asks the specialist, it's like, hey, how much is it going to take? And he's like, I'm going to add 30% of a buffer. Then the lead adds 30% of a buffer to it. He goes to the executive producer. The executive producer adds 30% of a buffer. And suddenly, yeah, we'll make this indie premium game for $10 million. Why? Oh, we have a huge buffer, and we would definitely deliver it. Funny enough, it probably will cost $10 million, but you will not sign it if you're going to say it. I'm just saying. So don't multiply the buffers. For the external context, projects cannot handle external context on itself, right? Like a lot of companies fall because they're like a one-project companies, right? And if something goes wrong in the project, they basically go bankrupt and fall over. So creating a company, not a team, gives you contingencies, right? You can have proper processes, like for example, in recent years, we have proper processes for team assembly and personnel transfer. We're tracking how to assemble teams for our new upcoming projects, right? In theory, this is a work in progress. Anshar is not there yet. In theory, when you're getting a senior programmer, you know what you're getting, right? In theory, you should be able, when you're assembling a team, to have enough structure from an HR and career development path perspective to actually know what you're getting yourselves into. So if I have 5 programmers in my budget, I know what kind of programmers I'm going to get, and I'm sure that I can deliver upon it, right? Not that we're on the fast, we're hiring 5 juniors that are transferring from Unity to Unreal and like, hey, you have 5 programmers, why are you complaining? You have stuff like controlling, which I already talked about. You have legal, which I already talked about. For example, Anshar studios have their own playtesting studios and UXR research and many, many more, right? The company gives you kind of a safety net and tools to handle external factors that the project cannot handle themselves, right? So thinking of video game development as purely a team, I think it's also a false goal. You need to have a company to actually take care of the team. I won't delve much more into that. I've done shitload of talks on it, like last year at Digital Dragons. I did growth pains at GAC 2 years back. I wrote an article on it. You can go check it out. We're moving forward. And finally, there is no do. There's only try. Okay? So we are in a hit-driven business. There is absolutely no guarantee that your project's going to be a hit, right? The only thing that you can control is how many times you actually try, right? So you need to maximize your chances of success. So, saying to me, oh, no, need to have a successful mindset that this is going to be a $1 billion franchise, right? It's like, I hate that talk, right? Of course we want to make a $1 billion franchise. Of course we want to strive for the stars. Of course that we are trying to do the best job ever. But it's a false goal to assume that you can predict that success. So to be sane in game dev, from my perspective, you need to be definitely the journey type of a person, right? Not the destination type of a person. On that note, I highly recommend The Black Swan and Anti-Fragile, both books by Nassim Nicholas Taleb that delve deeper into this hit-driven business. And by hit, in that book, it mentions black swans, right? Like a hit is a black swan, something that you cannot predict. But to finalize, it sounds like I know what I'm doing, although you kind of know that I don't, because nobody knows how to make video games. So I just wanted to give you an example that we are all constantly learning, right? So a story from our recent budget. We created a budget only for the POC, so by the book, phase-based development, right? We created a budget for the POC, and that budget was given to an executive producer like, hey, build a team, right? There are all those tools that are now built in the company for you to fight for the team, right? Because everybody fights to have the best team possible. So we supplied the data, and we don't have a full, from a GDPR perspective, but whatever, we don't have a policy where everybody knows everybody's salary, right? I mean, we have salaries per department, we have average salaries, everybody, this data is transparent, but the exec got the average month per department and hey, build yourself a budget, right? Inside the given budget. Build yourself a team. But at the same time, the heads implemented, we implemented how we want to approach ideation at our company. And a lot of it went down into team building, initial team building, who's on your core team, what type of personality, what type of skill set. They need to be multi-specialization, super senior people that are open to take responsibility, very good at communication, basically, unicorns, right? Ideation team should be really ideal. And turns out the ideal ideation team is far from average, right? So when the executive producer hey, okay, this is my team, this is what I need to do to deliver this, he was by 15% off, right? After we signed the deal, obviously, right? Because we signed the deal on a budget and then we built the team around it. So off the bat, we're 50% below the expectation. And we didn't even do anything wrong. It was a misunderstanding, right? Thankfully, we caught it early on an executive sync that I mentioned previously. And we only signed it on a POC, right? So now we have a super strong case when we renegotiate with the publisher our next phase, if the project is going to be greenlit, that, hey, this is how much it takes, you see? Great team, great results, give us more money. So we're constantly learning, right? We're constantly iterating and we're constantly striving to be better at making video games. But I would never say that this is a goal that you can attain, right? We were just mitigating stuff. And I was so afraid I'm going to end up like Sven, and I'm going to go over time that I got under time. So, yeah, thank you. We have more time for questions. Are there any?
You can use microphone in the middle of the room.
Hey. Thank you for amazing lecture, per usual. I wanted to ask, because you actually have two questions. First one being, you mentioned post-production being this sacred ground of let's not get there and let's not use it as a buffer. I wonder what's your approach when you do have a realization that you are going to be forced to use it as a buffer, or you're going to step on the sacred ground and you already chopped everything else. Do you go into time boxing to match the estimates that came out of that initial exercise you're doing, or do you handle it differently?
It's a tough question because it's always like context-based depending on the project, right? So I can mention like a couple of projects that we had recently that we bumped into that, right? So for example, project codename Mayhem at our studio is right now in an awkward phase because officially it's like late alpha, early beta, but unofficially we're actually almost in post-production because the content is almost complete and we're already polishing a lot of stuff, right? And in there, the biggest challenge for me is not what I mentioned earlier is you need to decrease the team. That's the actual sign. You're not in post-production where you're not decreasing the team. Because if you keep creating stuff, then you're just fooling yourself, right? You're still in production. But your question is more on the lines of, okay, but if I'm there, what do I do, right? So the problem is that the easiest thing to cut is content. But if it's late in production, you're almost done with content, right? So suddenly actually chopping stuff out creates more work, right? Because, hey, we need to now redo the narrative, or the VOs are already recorded, or whatever. So I would say that if you overrun in late production, then you don't have much option, actually, other than renegotiate the post-production contracts, right? Obviously, you can do all the usual suspects, like let's focus only on this, or use the Moscow, or whatever, or cut whatever we can. But it's already too late, right? It's like you're going to overrun, basically. So I would say that you end up in that situation. Why do you end up in that situation? You end up in that situation because somebody said that we're an alpha because that's what the milestone sheet says, not because you actually are, right? That's the reason you end up in the first place. So you kind of don't give me any room, right, anymore. So I don't have a great answer to you, other than usually I would just go and negotiate the contract. And this is what we do more often than I would like to do.
Amazing. Thank you. So I have a second one, if you don't mind. So the second one is when you do have those exercises and you come up with a budget, the amendments, you have a whole structure, and do you actually then collect the data from, Jira, you have your exports, do you create a database of data that you can compare your original estimates to just come up with how accurate are your original budgeting and how you do that?
I would so like to answer to that question. Oh, of course we do. And no. So this is something that we very much strive to. And for example, in our projects right now, we do have a lot of Jira tracking. The problem is that how are you going to compare a remake of Layers of Fear to a first-person co-op shooter, right? And there are some things that you can compare, right? But actually, even if I think about it, no, you can't. Because what I wanted to say, well, you can compare, how we did the Lightning, for example, right? And how we used Lumen, but Mayhem is on Unreal Engine 4, there's no Lumen. So basically, there's not a lot of things that you can compare in that regards. If you would do, because Sven's talk on Baldur's Gate, right? The same thing he said on GDC. They didn't accurately, the most thing that they were not accurate on was the new things, so the cinematic pipelines, right? The other stuff they kind of knew how to do. So the hope is that if we're going to do another first-person co-op shooter, we have all this data, and we can actually compare it, right? But on that note, I just wanted to say that one of the common mistakes I see is that we have data from the first iteration. It's like, hey, we did this weapon in, let's say, 6 months. Big weapon, whatever. We did it in 6 months. And then we're like, yeah, but it's the first weapon. Next is going to take 2 weeks. it's not going to take 2 weeks, right? It's going to take 5 months at best, right? So maybe 4. So we tend to over-rely on the fact that now we know more, and hence we're going to do things faster, right? Which is true, but we always overestimate how much faster it's going to be.
Amazing. Thank you.
Cześć Łukasz. So my question to you is, how do you approach scoping outsource and how you protect yourself from wishful thinking that you're gonna outsource this to someone and it's gonna get rid of all your problems you're having?
Oh, thank you for a super easy question. We don't outsource shit. It's like we have 170 people on board and we are like a full-stop shop. So we try to do everything in-house. The only thing we outsource is localization, basically, and VO recordings, and music also. So the 3 things that I mentioned on the sheet that are apart from our main months. And to be honest, we tried that. We were awful at it. We were absolutely awful at it. We didn't have the pipelines. I know that there are companies out there that are like built on the foundation that it's co-dev, that we just have a core team inside and we outsource a lot of stuff. So we do use freelancers but we use it in the same way as we would be using overtime. For example, it's like, hey, we're a little bit behind here. Let's add an animator, but let's not hire an animator. Let's just, I have a friend and he's going to freelance for us for 6 months. But it's not like that we approach an animation company in UK or China or wherever, and we like have a contract for a big part of that, right? We don't have these pipelines. I don't have that know-how, and it sounds scary. So that's. Oh, hey. How can I help you, sir?
Yes, the one thing that I haven't heard you mentioning often during your talk is the importance of proper people, proper team, proper competence being there in your project. And I wonder what's your take on people, their expertise, their attitude, their dependency on being micromanaged. How do you calculate that into this whole budget being so uncertain thing?
So yeah, well, for example, last time we not calculated it by 15%, so I say that we do take that into account. But no, that I don't see it as I know that there is a direct correlation, budget and your team, right? But building, from my perspective, building a team, making sure that you have the right people on the right positions, etc. It's like a whole other production, like this big pile of production thing. Problems that we had regarding that is that I mentioned talent availability. Everybody is at Anshar Studios. I really envy people that have one project in that regard. I mean, it's a high risk, but then you know what people you're going to have, right? You're going to have everybody. Once we have 6 active projects at Anshar Studios right now. And you know that every company has those couple of people, right? Like, I don't know, like 10, I mean, at our company, it's probably like 16 or 20 people that everybody wants them, exactly them, right? And everybody wants to work with them because they know that they're expert at tech art or at this or at that. And one of the big things that we're right now calculating into our budgeting, which we'll see if it pans out, is what if you don't have that person? Because we know that, hey, we have 1 of them or 2 of them, right, that they can handle that, and we need 4. So I've been assuming in the past that, hey, if we're going to have money, we're just going to hire them. It doesn't work that way. It never panned out, right? I mean, it usually didn't pan out, right? Sometimes we get lucky. So. But from the perspective of team building, I think that the ideation, what I said at first, that theme, that core is super important to assemble, that you need to have both the skill set and the communication inside. And the idea is, and that's a big problem on our side, is that the core team starts the project and finishes the project, right? And in the middle, you have what we call, like, you have heads and hands, right? In the middle, you have a lot of muscle that actually makes the game happen. They're super important to delivering the game because without them, they would have like a bunch of cool systems but no content. But the thing is that when you finish the project, you want to start a new project, and suddenly you need the same team that we've run it that time and again. You suddenly need the same team that is finishing the project. You need to start another project. Not to mention, you know, they're burned out, they would need a break, like a longer holiday, maybe a sabbatical, whatever, right? So we haven't solved that. In
Right,
short.
So
it's like my go-to answer is like, I don't know, I haven't solved that. I'm an expert.
the way I understand you is that what you're saying is that if you, in theory, were able to assemble the team of those dream people and have them and rely on them during the whole production cycle, that there is a hope, there is a chance for budget being much more predictable than what you described. What you're saying is that having this team on which you can rely and not having to reassign them to other projects is outside of the realm of possibility.
I wouldn't even say that it would happen with that dream team. I can say that you can predict this well for a given phase. But because the phases change the context of future phases, I strongly believe that you cannot predict the budget of the video game, even if you have the dream team, right? It's because after ideation, you're going to know much more. After pre-production, you're going to know more. So in an ideal world, after pre-production, you can like perfectly predict the budget. In the ideal world, right? That's what I would say.
Thank you.
You have like 3 minutes or something, I don't know. So any other questions? Nope? Okay. Thank you very much then.